Some scents are not remembered, they are mourned. The northern wind carried ash and blood through the valley of Valkrim, where winter ruled with iron silence. Ilara knelt in the snow outside the stone gates of the Thornridge Pack, her knees burning against frozen earth, her breath a ghost dissolving into the gray dawn. She pressed one hand to her belly, where life grew in secret defiance of the world that cast her out. The rejection had been absolute, no trial, no mercy. Only the Alpha's voice, cold as the mountains themselves, declaring her unworthy of the pack bond. She had stood in the great hall with her head bowed, unable to speak, unable to defend herself against accusations she did not understand. The pack had watched in silence as the beta tore the silver crest from her cloak and shattered it against the stone floor. "You are no longer one of us," the Alpha had said. "Leave before moonrise, or we will hunt you as we hunt rogues." Now, hours later, she sat alone in the wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing inside her. A child conceived in a single night of impossible heat, when her body had betrayed every instinct of survival and drawn her to a stranger whose eyes burned gold in the darkness. She had not known his name. She had not seen his face clearly. But his scent had imprinted on her soul like a brand. Cedarwood and smoke, blood and iron, ancient and unyielding. He had left before dawn without a word. She had woken alone in the forest clearing, her skin marked with his touch, her wolf whimpering with loss. She had returned to her pack believing it was a fever dream, a madness brought on by the spring equinox. But her body knew the truth. Life had taken root where it should not have been possible. An Omega alone, without a mate, without a bond, carrying a child that would condemn her. The snow fell harder now, thick and relentless. Ilara rose on unsteady legs and turned her back on the only home she had ever known. The forest stretched before her, dark and infinite, and she walked into it without looking back. Her wolf was silent inside her, subdued by grief and exhaustion. But somewhere deep in her chest, a small flame of defiance still burned. She would survive. She had to. Not for herself, but for the life she carried. The trees closed around her like a cathedral of ice. The wind howled through the branches, and in its voice she heard the echo of ancient songs, prayers to the moon goddess whispered by wolves long dead. Ilara pulled her thin cloak tighter and kept walking, one foot in front of the other, following a path only instinct could see. Hours passed. The sun never fully rose, hidden behind walls of gray cloud. Her legs trembled with cold and hunger. Her fingers were numb. But she did not stop. She could not. To stop was to die. Then, in the distance, she saw it, a flicker of orange light through the trees. Fire, shelter, hope. Ilara stumbled forward, her breath ragged, her vision blurring. The light grew brighter, warmer. She pushed through a thicket of frozen brambles and emerged into a small clearing where a cave mouth yawned dark against the mountainside. Outside the cave, a fire burned low, its flames licking at blackened wood. And beside the fire, slumped against a boulder with blood soaking through his furs, was a man. No, not a man. An Alpha. His scent hit her like a wall, cedarwood and smoke, blood and iron, the same scent that had haunted her dreams for months. Ilara's knees buckled. She fell to the snow, her hand clutching her belly, her wolf rising inside her with a howl of recognition that tore through her chest like lightning. The Alpha's eyes opened, gold, burning, unforgettable. He stared at her across the fire, his face pale with pain, his breathing shallow. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind screamed through the trees. The fire crackled and hissed. Then he spoke, his voice rough as gravel, broken as shattered glass. "You." The word hung between them like a blade suspended in air, trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. Ilara could not breathe, could not think. Her wolf clawed at her chest, desperate and wild, demanding she close the distance, demanding she touch him, taste him, claim what was theirs. But her human mind held her frozen, caught between terror and impossible recognition. He was hurt, badly. Blood seeped through the torn leather of his armor, dark and thick, staining the snow beneath him. A wound in his side, deep enough to see the pale flash of bone beneath shredded flesh. His right arm hung useless at his side, and his breathing came in shallow, controlled bursts, the breathing of a warrior who had learned to endure pain as a constant companion. But his eyes never left hers, gold and fierce, burning through the gray light of approaching dusk with predatory focus. He was reading her, cataloging every detail, every tremor, every scent molecule that rose from her skin. And she knew, with terrible certainty, that he remembered. "How did you find me?" His voice was quieter now, edged with suspicion and something else. Something that sounded almost like wonder. Ilara's lips parted, but no sound came. She had not spoken in 3 years. Not since the fever that had stolen her voice as a child, leaving only silence where words should have been. The pack had called her cursed, broken, useless. An Omega who could not speak was an Omega who could not serve, could not lead hunts or teach pups or sing the moon prayers. She had learned to communicate through gestures, through the subtle language of scent and posture that all wolves understood. But now, facing this stranger who was not a stranger, she had nothing. She pressed her hand to her throat, then shook her head slowly. The Alpha's eyes narrowed. "You cannot speak." It was not a question. He was stating fact, processing information, adjusting his understanding of the situation. Ilara nodded once, keeping her gaze lowered in the instinctive submission that had been beaten into her since childhood. Do not challenge, do not provoke, do not draw attention. But then his scent shifted, softened, and she felt the change in the air like a drop in temperature. When she dared to look up again, his expression had transformed. The suspicion was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, regret, recognition, pain that had nothing to do with his wounds. "I left you," he said, and the words were confession and accusation both. "That morning, I should not have." Ilara's chest tightened. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin she was, how ragged her clothes, how visible her exile must be to eyes trained to see weakness. She was a stray, a rogue, a wolf without a pack, carrying a secret that would doom her if discovered. But he did not know. He could not possibly know. The Alpha tried to rise, but his body betrayed him. He gasped and fell back against the boulder, his face twisting with pain. Fresh blood welled from the wound in his side, spreading across his armor like a crimson flower blooming in snow. Ilara moved without thinking. She crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps and dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, assessing the damage. It was deep, too deep. Infection would set in soon if it was not cleaned and stitched. She could smell the sickness already beginning to fester beneath the torn flesh. "Do not," he said roughly, catching her wrist in his good hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were fierce. "I am not your burden." She met his gaze and held it, defiant for the first time in her life. Then she pulled her wrist free and began tearing strips from the hem of her cloak. She had nothing else. No herbs, no salve, no needle and thread. But she could stop the bleeding. She could buy him time. The Alpha watched her work in silence, his jaw clenched against the pain. She pressed the cloth firmly against the wound, applying pressure to slow the flow of blood. He hissed through his teeth, but did not pull away. His scent surrounded her, overwhelming and intoxicating, stirring memories of that night in the forest, the heat of his skin, the weight of his body, the way he had whispered words she could not understand against her throat. "Why are you alone?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Where is your pack?" Ilara did not answer. Could not answer. She kept her eyes on her work, tying the makeshift bandage tight around his torso. Her hands were steady, despite the trembling in her chest. She had learned long ago to hide her emotions, to make herself small and silent and invisible. But then his hand rose to cup her cheek, gentle as snow falling, and she froze. "You are exiled," he said softly, reading the truth in her silence. "They cast you out." A single tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She closed her eyes, shame burning through her like acid. He would see her weakness now. He would understand what she was. Nothing. No one. A broken omega unworthy of pack or bond or life. But his thumb brushed the tear away with infinite tenderness. "Then we are the same," he murmured. "Both of us running from kingdoms that no longer want us." Ilara's eyes flew open. She stared at him, confusion and disbelief warring in her chest. An Alpha King? Exiled? Impossible. He smiled, bitter and bleak. "I am Chaol Thornheart, once sovereign of the Northern Reach, now hunted by my own blood council. They call me traitor, oathbreaker, the king who chose mercy over war." His hand fell away from her face, and he leaned his head back against the boulder, exhaustion etched into every line of his body. And perhaps they are right. The fire burned low as night claimed the forest. Ilara fed it carefully, breaking branches into pieces small enough to catch flame, building the heat slowly so it would last through the long hours of darkness. Chaol had fallen into a restless sleep, his breathing shallow but steady, his face pale against the dark fur of his cloak. She had done what she could for his wounds, cleaned them with melted snow, packed them with moss torn from the rocks near the cave entrance, bound them tight with strips of cloth that would not hold for long. He would need proper medicine, a healer. But there were no healers in the wilderness, and no pack would shelter a rogue and an exiled king. They were alone with the wolves and the winter and the slow creep of infection that would kill him if she could not find help. Ilara sat cross-legged by the fire and stared into the flames. Her wolf was restless, pacing inside her mind, confused by the proximity of the Alpha who was her child's father, but not her mate. The bond that should have formed between them that night in the forest had never manifested. He had not claimed her. She had not submitted. They had come together in heat and instinct, two bodies recognizing something in each other that their conscious minds could not name. And now she carried the proof of that night, growing stronger every day despite the hunger and the cold and the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the subtle swell beneath her ribs. Not visible yet, not to eyes untrained in the signs, but it would be soon. And then there would be no hiding what she was. A pregnant omega without a mate was a death sentence. The pack laws were clear. Life could only be sanctioned within the bonds of mating or with explicit permission from the Alpha. To carry a child outside those structures was to invite chaos, to threaten the bloodlines, to dishonor the goddess herself. Ilara had broken the most sacred law without meaning to, and now she would pay the price. Unless she ran far enough, unless she disappeared into the wild places where pack law could not reach, unless she built a life in the spaces between kingdoms, raising her child in secret until they were strong enough to survive on their own. But looking at Chaol now, wounded and vulnerable, she felt something shift inside her, a different kind of survival, a different kind of strength. He had called himself a traitor for choosing mercy. What would he call her if he knew the truth? A sound broke through her thoughts, a howl in the distance, low and hunting. Ilara's head snapped up, her wolf rising to alertness. Another howl answered the first, closer this time, echoing through the trees with predatory intent. Not wolves, hunters. Chaol's eyes opened. He was awake instantly. His body tense despite the pain, his gaze sharp and focused on the darkness beyond the fire. "How many?" he asked quietly. Ilara held up 3 fingers, then hesitated and added one more. 4. maybe 5, moving in a pattern, encircling the clearing, cutting off escape routes. Professional, trained, soldiers, not rogues. The Blood Council, Kyle said grimly. He tried to rise and failed, his body refusing to obey. They have been tracking me for days. I thought I lost them in the northern pass. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the calculation of a king weighing options. Go, while you still can. They want me, not you. Alara did not move. Go, he repeated, his voice harder now, edged with command. You owe me nothing. She met his gaze and shook her head slowly. Then she reached into the fire and pulled out a burning branch, holding it like a weapon. The flames cast wild shadows across her face, and in that moment she looked like something ancient and feral, a creature of ash and moonlight who had forgotten how to fear. Kyle stared at her, something like awe flickering across his features. You would fight for me? You do not even know me. But she did know him. She knew the scent of his skin and the weight of his touch and the way he had held her in the darkness as if she were something precious. She knew he had whispered apologies against her throat, even as his body claimed hers. She knew he had left before dawn, not because he did not care, but because he cared too much. And she knew with certainty that transcended logic, that their fates were bound together in ways neither of them yet understood. The howls grew closer. Shapes moved in the darkness beyond the firelight, shadows with eyes that gleamed silver and gold. Alara planted herself between Kyle and the approaching hunters, her makeshift torch held high, her wolf snarling defiance inside her chest. Then a voice called out from the darkness, smooth and cold as winter ice. Surrender the traitor, Omega, and we will let you live. Alara's answer was the fire in her hand and the absolute stillness of her body. She would not move, would not yield, would not surrender what was hers to protect. The voice laughed, low and cruel. So be it. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments of the night they find you. The first hunter came from the left, a blur of silver fur and muscle exploding from the tree line with lethal precision. Alara swung the burning branch in a wide arc, and the creature skidded back, snarling, its eyes glowing with predatory fury. But it did not retreat. It circled, patient and calculating, waiting for her guard to drop. Behind her, she heard Kale struggling to rise. You cannot hold them alone, he rasped, his voice tight with pain and frustration. Let me... She shot him a single glance over her shoulder, fierce and unyielding, and he fell silent. There was something in her eyes that stopped the words in his throat, not submission, not fear, but a kind of primal certainty that transcended language. She had chosen her position. She would hold it or die trying. The second hunter appeared on the right, moving in tandem with the first, coordinating their approach with the efficiency of soldiers who had hunted together for years. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She had no weapon but fire and will, no training but instinct, and yet she felt her wolf rising inside her, stronger than it had ever been, flooding her muscles with strength she did not know she possessed. The third hunter came from directly ahead, and this one did not circle. It charged straight for her throat, jaws wide, claws extended, moving too fast for human eyes to track. Alara dropped to one knee and thrust the burning branch upward. The hunter's momentum carried it forward onto the flames. It screamed, a sound that was neither wolf nor human, but something caught between, and twisted away, its fur smoking, its flesh seared. It retreated into the darkness, whimpering, defeated but not dead. The remaining hunters paused, reassessing. Alara rose slowly, her chest heaving, her wolf howling victory inside her mind. The fire in her hand had burned down to embers, but she held it like a sword, daring them to try again. Then, The voice from the darkness spoke again, and this time there was grudging respect in its tone. Impressive, but you are outnumbered, little Omega, and fire burns out eventually. A fourth shape emerged from the trees, larger than the others, moving with the deliberate confidence of a commander. In the dim firelight, Alara could make out the silver insignia on its collar, the mark of the Blood Council's elite guard. This was no ordinary hunter. This was an executioner. Kale's hand closed around her ankle, gentle but firm. Alara? Her name. He had remembered her name, though she had never spoken it aloud. The realization sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold or fear. He had known her scent from the moment she appeared in the clearing. He had been searching for her, even if he did not realize it until now. She looked down at him, and in his eyes she saw something that broke through the warrior's mask. Desperation. Not for himself, but for her. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, an alpha who had chosen exile over violence. And now he was asking her to do the same, to run, to survive, to let him bear the consequences of his choices alone. But Alara had spent her entire life running, from cruelty, from rejection, from the voice inside her that whispered she was worth more than silence and submission. She had run from the pack that cast her out, and she would run no further. She shook her head, slow and deliberate. Kyle's grip tightened. Please. The executioner stepped into the firelight, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was a woman, tall and lethal, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in warrior braids and eyes that burned with cold intelligence. She wore the black leather armor of the Blood Council, and at her hip hung a blade that gleamed like frozen starlight. I am Sylvain Blackthorn, first blade of the Northern Reach, the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. King Cale Thornheart, you are summoned to answer for the crime of treason against your own Blood Council. Surrender now, and your death will be swift and honorable. Honorable, Cale repeated, and there was bitter laughter in his voice. You call it honor to execute a king for refusing to slaughter innocents? Sylvain's expression did not change. You swore an oath to protect the realm. You broke that oath when you granted amnesty to the Ravenhill refugees, 300 wolves from a rival kingdom sheltered within our borders, feeding from our resources. You made us vulnerable. You made us weak. I made us merciful, Kyle said quietly. There is a difference. Mercy is for the strong, Your Majesty, not for the dying. Sylvain's gaze shifted to Alara, cold and assessing. And you, Omega. Why do you defend a traitor king? He is not your alpha, not your mate. What loyalty binds you to him? Alara said nothing. She could not. But she took a step forward, placing herself more fully between Sylvain and Cale, her body a living shield. Sylvain's eyes narrowed. You are with child. It was not a question. The woman's senses were too sharp, her instincts too honed by years of hunting and killing. She had scented the truth the moment she entered the clearing, and now that truth hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Whose child? Sylvain asked softly, dangerously. Who has claimed you, Omega? Alara's silence was answer enough. Sylvain's gaze flicked to Cale. An understanding dawned like ice cracking beneath weight. Impossible! Nothing is impossible, Cale said, his voice steady despite the pain. Only forbidden. You mated with a rogue? Sylvain's voice rose with disbelief and fury. You who swore to uphold pack law above all else? You who condemned countless others for lesser transgressions? I did not know what she was, Cale said quietly. I knew only that she was alone in the forest. And I was alone, and the moon was full, and for one night I forgot what I was supposed to be. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with regret. I did not know she would carry my child. I did not know I would spend the next 3 months searching for a scent I could not forget. Sylvain stared at him, her face unreadable. Then she drew her blade, and the sound of steel leaving its sheath was like a prayer ending. "Then I will grant you both mercy," she said. "You will die together." The blade gleamed in the firelight, beautiful and terrible, forged from northern steel that had tasted the blood of 1,000 condemned. Sylvain held it with the casual grace of a woman who had spent her life dealing death, and in her eyes there was no malice, only duty. She would kill them because it was her purpose, because the Blood Council had decreed it, because mercy in her world was the final kindness offered to the lost. But before she could move, the forest itself seemed to shift. The wind died. The fire stilled. The very air grew heavy with a presence that pressed down on them like the weight of centuries, ancient and absolute. Alara felt it first, a tingling in her spine, a pulling in her chest, as if invisible threads were drawing her towards something vast and unknowable. Her wolf fell silent, not in fear, but in reverence, bowing before a power it recognized from blood memory and ancestral dreams. Then the moon emerged from behind the clouds, full and blazing, and its light poured into the clearing like liquid silver. It touched Alara's skin, and she gasped, her body flooding with warmth, with strength, with something that felt like awakening from a lifelong sleep. The pain in her limbs vanished. The exhaustion that had weighed her down for weeks evaporated, and in its place rose a power she did not recognize, surging through her veins like wildfire. Her hands began to glow, soft at first, a gentle luminescence that barely pierced the darkness. But it grew brighter, stronger, until her palms shone like twin moons, casting light that pushed back the shadows and turned the snow around her to fields of crystal. She stared at them in shock and wonder, her wolf howling with recognition deep in her soul. Pathfinder. The word came not from her mind, but from some older, deeper place, the collective memory of her bloodline, passed down through generations of Omegas who had carried the moon goddess's gift in secret. Healers, seers, guides between worlds, those who could walk between life and death and bring back the lost. Behind her, Kale made a sound of awe. "Goddess, have mercy." Sylvain had frozen, her blade still raised, but her eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear. "It cannot be. The Pathfinder line died out centuries ago." "Clearly not," Kyle said, and there was wonder in his voice now, layered with understanding. "She is the reason the moon led me to that forest. She is the reason I could not forget her scent. The goddess chose her for me." Alara turned to look at him, and the light from her hands illuminated his face, casting away the shadows of pain and exhaustion. Without thinking, without planning, she knelt beside him and placed her glowing palms over his wounds. The effect was immediate. Light poured from her hands into his body, warm and golden, knitting torn flesh, mending shattered bone, purging infection and poison from his blood. Kale gasped, his back arching, his hands clutching at the snow beneath him as the healing surged through him like lightning. It was not gentle. It was transformation, violent and absolute, remaking him from the inside out. When it was done, Alara fell back, her hands dimming, her body trembling with exhaustion. The power had drained from her as quickly as it came, leaving her hollow and weak. But Kyle sat upright, whole and healed, staring at his hands in disbelief. The wounds were gone. Not scarred, not bandaged, gone, as if they had never existed. Sylvain lowered her blade slowly, her face pale. "The goddess has spoken. Then you will not kill them." One of the other hunters asked, confusion and uncertainty in his voice. "I cannot kill what the goddess has claimed," Sylvain said quietly. She sheathed her blade and took a step back, her posture shifting from executioner to something closer to witness. "King Kale Thornheart, the Blood Council summoned me to end your life, but I am not fool enough to defy a divine intervention." Kyle rose to his feet, steady and strong, his gaze never leaving Alara. "Then what will you do?" "I will return to the council and tell them the truth, that the traitor king is protected by a pathfinder and that the goddess herself has chosen his fate. Sylvain's eyes met his, hard and unyielding. But know this, your majesty, the council will not accept this easily. They will call it deception, witchcraft. They will hunt you both to the ends of the earth if they must. Let them try, Kyle said softly. He moved to Ilara's side and knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms as her body went limp with exhaustion. She has given me back my life. I will spend the rest of it ensuring she never regrets it. Sylvain watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she inclined her head, a gesture of respect rarely offered to exiles and rogues. May the goddess guide your path, Pathfinder, and may she grant you the strength to survive what comes next. She turned and disappeared into the darkness, her hunters following. The forest swallowed them whole, and within moments it was as if they had never been there at all. Kale held Ilara close, his arms wrapped around her protectively, his face buried in her hair. I do not know what you are, he whispered, but I know that you are mine, and I will never leave you again. Ilara could not speak, could not move, but deep in her chest, where the child grew and her wolf slept and her heart beat steady and strong, she felt something click into place. A bond, fragile and new, but real, undeniable. They were no longer strangers in the darkness. They were two exiles bound by fate and the moon, standing together against a world that wanted them destroyed. And for the first time since her exile began, Ilara felt something that resembled hope. The cave became their sanctuary. For 3 days they sheltered there, hidden from the world, learning each other in the language of silence and touch. Kyle hunted while Ilara gathered what she could from the frozen forest, roots, herbs, bark that could be brewed into bitter tea. They ate sparingly and spoke rarely, but in the quiet spaces between words, something deeper grew. Trust, understanding. The slow unfurling of two souls who had been broken by their worlds and were now being remade by each other. Kyle learned to read her gestures, the tilt of her head, the subtle movements of her hands that conveyed more than words ever could. She learned his silences, the way his eyes darkened when he thought of the kingdom he had lost, the tension in his shoulders when nightmares pulled him from sleep. They were both haunted, both hunted, both carrying guilt that weighed heavier than any physical burden. On the 4th morning, Kale woke to find her standing at the cave entrance, staring out at the snow-covered valley below. The dawn light caught in her hair, turning it silver gold, and for a moment she looked like something from the old legends, a moon spirit taking mortal form, walking among wolves to test their worthiness. He approached quietly, careful not to startle her, and stopped at her side. What do you see? She pointed toward the horizon, where a thin column of smoke rose from behind a distant ridge. Civilization. A pack settlement, most likely. Perhaps even a town large enough to have a healer's house, a blacksmith, supplies they desperately needed. You want to go there, Kyle said, understanding immediately. Ilara nodded, then hesitated. She touched her belly, then made a cradling gesture with her arms. The child would need more than what the wilderness could provide. Shelter, safety, a midwife when the time came. It is dangerous, Kyle said quietly. They will recognize me, and if they discover what you are... She turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw a determination that took his breath away. She was no longer the frightened, exiled Omega he had found bleeding in the snow. Something had changed in her, awakened by the power that had flowed through her hands. She was still silent, still vulnerable, but there was steel beneath the softness now, a core of strength that would not bend. She reached up and placed her hand over his heart, then over her own. Then she pointed to the smoke again. Together, Kale said, and it was not a question. Whatever comes, we face it together. She smiled, small and fleeting, but real. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and the sight of it struck him like a physical blow. Beauty and sorrow, hope and fear, all contained in the curve of her lips. They packed what little they had and set out at midday, moving carefully through the forest, following deer trails and frozen streams. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained brutal, turning their breath to clouds and their fingers to ice. Kyle stayed close, always within reach, his senses alert for danger. But the forest remained quiet, empty of hunters and soldiers alike. By evening they reached the ridge, and from that vantage point they could see the settlement below. It was larger than Kyle had expected, not a town but a city, sprawling across the valley floor with walls of stone and timber, smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. Banners flew from the towers, deep crimson emblazoned with a silver wolf, the mark of the Ironwood Dominion. Kyle's blood ran cold. "No!" Alara looked at him, confusion in her eyes. "This is my brother's territory," Kyle said, his voice tight. "Darius Thornheart, who sits on my stolen throne and leads the blood council that condemned me." He turned away from the city, running a hand through his hair, frustration and fear warring in his chest. "We cannot go there. He will kill me the moment he sees me." But Ilara caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. When he looked at her, she shook her head firmly. Then she pointed to her belly again, then to the city, then back to him. Her meaning was clear. The child's life was more important than his pride, more important than old grudges and broken oaths. "You would ask me to surrender to him?" Kyle asked, disbelief sharpening his tone. "To walk into the teeth of the wolf and beg for mercy?" She nodded. Not surrender. Mercy. There was a difference, and she knew he understood it. He had chosen mercy once before, granting amnesty to the refugees when the council demanded their execution. That choice had cost him everything, his crown, his kingdom, his freedom. But it had been the right choice, the only choice a man of honor could make. Now she was asking him to choose mercy again, not for strangers, but for himself, for her, for their child. Kyle closed his eyes, warring with himself. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to find another way, to avoid the brother who had betrayed him. But when he opened his eyes again and saw Ilara watching him with absolute faith, he knew there was no other choice. "If we do this," he said slowly, "there is a chance we will both die." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. Then she smiled again, sad and certain, and in that smile he saw her answer. Better to die trying than to surrender without a fight. Kale pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers, breathing in her scent, pine and snow, and something uniquely hers, wild and impossibly precious. "Then we go together, and if your goddess is listening, I pray she grants us a miracle." They descended the ridge as twilight fell, walking hand in hand toward the city that glowed like a jewel in the valley below. Toward judgment or redemption. Toward death or life. Toward whatever fate the goddess had written in the stars. Subscribe if you believe mercy can crown even the fallen. The gates of Ironwood stood 30 feet high, carved from blackened oak and reinforced with iron bands that had been forged in dragonfire centuries ago. Guards flanked the entrance, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their spears crossed to bar the way. They watched Kale and Ilara approach with the cold suspicion of soldiers trained to see threats in every shadow. "State your business," the senior guard commanded, his voice flat and official. Kale stepped forward, pulling back the hood of his cloak to reveal his face. The guard's eyes widened, recognition flashing across his features like lightning. "King Kale." "Not anymore," Kale said quietly. "I come to petition the throne for asylum, for myself and my companion." The guard's gaze shifted to Ilara, lingering on her swollen belly before snapping back to Kale's face. "The Blood Council has declared you traitor. I cannot grant you entry without the High Alpha's explicit command." "Then summon him," Kale said, his tone steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. "Tell Darius that his brother requests an audience. He can refuse, and we will leave. Or he can grant us entrance and hear what I have to say. The choice is his." The guard hesitated, torn between duty and protocol. Finally, he gestured to one of the younger soldiers. "Fetch Commander Sylvain. She will know what to do." While they waited, a crowd began to gather. Citizens of Ironwood, drawn by the commotion, pressing close to see what stranger had arrived to disturb their evening. Kyle felt their stares like physical touches, curious, hostile, afraid. He kept Alara close, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, shielding her from the worst of their scrutiny. "Is that really him?" someone whispered. "The traitor king," another voice confirmed. "He should be executed on sight. Look at the woman with him. She is with child. Probably stole her from some other pack." The murmurs grew louder, uglier, and Kale felt Alara trembling against him. He wanted to defend her, to silence the cruel voices, but he knew better than to provoke a mob. They were trapped now, caught between the closed gates and the growing crowd, with nowhere to run if the situation turned violent. Then the gates opened, and Sylvain Blackthorn emerged, flanked by 24 Bloodguard. She wore full ceremonial armor, black as midnight, and her face was a mask of cold professionalism. Her eyes found Kale immediately, and for a moment he thought he saw something like regret flicker across her features. "King Kale Thornheart," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "By order of the Blood Council and High Alpha Darius Thornheart, you are under arrest for treason, oath-breaking, and crimes against the Northern Reach." The crowd erupted in shouts and jeers. Kale felt Alara's hand clutch his, her fear palpable. But he did not move, did not flinch, did not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. "I request formal trial," he said, pitching his voice to Carrie. "By ancient law, any accused wolf has the right to speak before judgment is passed. I invoke that right now." Sylvain's jaw tightened. The council does not supersede ancient law," Kale interrupted, steel entering his voice. "Unless Darius has rewritten the codes I spent 20 years defending. Unless honor means nothing anymore in Ironwood." The crowd fell silent, sensing the challenge beneath his words. Sylvain stared at him for a long moment, then inclined her head fractionally. "Your request is acknowledged. You will be brought before the High Alpha at dawn. Until then, you will be held in the tower." "And the Omega?" Kale asked, his grip on Alara tightening. "She will be held separately, in quarters suitable for her condition." Sylvain's gaze flickered to Alara, softer now. "She will not be harmed." "I want your oath on that," Kyle said flatly. "Your personal oath, Sylvain, not the council's, yours." Sylvain's eyes narrowed, but after a moment she nodded. "On my honor as First Blade, the Omega will be protected. No harm will come to her or her child while she remains within these walls." It was the best he would get. Kyle turned to Alara, cupping her face in his hands, memorizing every detail. The curve of her cheekbone, the depth of her eyes, the way her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but could not. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "know that I do not regret any of it. Not the night we met, not the child you carry, not the choice I made to stand beside you." She pressed her hand over his heart, then her own, their wordless promise. Together. Always. Then the guards moved in, separating them with firm but not cruel hands. Kyle allowed himself to be led toward the tower, his wrists bound with silver chains that burned against his skin. He did not look back. Could not bear to see Alara being taken in the opposite direction, toward the women's quarters where she would spend the night alone, afraid, wondering if he would survive until dawn. The tower cell was small and cold, with a single narrow window that overlooked the valley. Kyle stood at that window for hours, staring out at the stars, thinking of all the choices that had led him here. The refugees he had sheltered, the council he had defied, the Omega he had found bleeding in the snow and recognized as his own. He had been a king once, powerful, respected, feared, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the silent woman who carried his child and the chance, however slim, that he could build a life with her that did not end in blood and ash. At midnight, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside his cell. Kyle turned, expecting a guard or perhaps Sylvain come to deliver some new verdict. Instead, his brother stood in the doorway. Darius Thornheart was everything Cale was not. Golden-haired where Cale was dark, broad-shouldered where Cale was lean, easy with charm where Cale carried gravity. They had been close once, before ambition and ideology drove a wedge between them. Before the council chose Darius to replace the brother, they deemed too soft, too merciful, too weak. "Hello, Kyle," Darius said quietly. "It has been a long time." "Not long enough," Kyle replied, his voice cold. Darius smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Still bitter, I see. Still convinced you were right and the rest of us were wrong." "I was right," Kyle said flatly, "and you know it." "Perhaps," Darius allowed, "but righteousness does not keep a kingdom safe. Mercy does not feed hungry wolves. You learned that lesson too late." "And you learned nothing at all," Cale shot back. "Tell me, brother, how many innocents have you condemned since you took my throne? How many refugees have you turned away? How many wolves have died because you chose cruelty over compassion?" Darius's smile faded. "I did what was necessary to protect our people." "You did what was easy," Kyle said. "And now you call it necessary to justify the blood on your hands." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Darius sighed. And for the first time, Cale saw weariness in his brother's eyes. "I did not come here to argue philosophy. I came to offer you a choice." "What choice?" "Renounce your claim to the throne. Publicly acknowledge your crimes and submit to exile. Do that, and I will let you live. You and the Omega both." Kyle stared at him. "And if I refuse?" "Then tomorrow you will face trial before the Full Blood Council. They will find you guilty, and you will be executed at sunset." Darius paused. "But the Omega will be spared. I give you my word on that. She and her child will be given safe passage beyond our borders." "Generous," Kyle said bitterly. "Tell me, brother, why show mercy now? Why not simply kill us both and be done with it?" Darius met his gaze, and in his eyes Cale saw something unexpected. Regret. "Because she is a pathfinder, and because even I am not fool enough to murder what the goddess has blessed." Dawn came cold and pale, spilling gray light through the narrow window of Cale's cell. He had not slept, could not sleep. His mind churned with his brother's words. The impossible choice laid before him like a blade balanced on its edge. Renounce everything he believed in and live, or hold to his convictions and die. Simple, terrible, absolute. The guards came for him as the sun crested the horizon, unlocking his cell with iron keys that rang like funeral bells. They led him through winding corridors and down stone steps, past tapestries that showed the history of Ironwood in threads of silver and crimson, great hunts, legendary battles, the founding of the pack under the light of the full moon. He had walked these halls as a child, as a prince learning to lead, as a king defending his people against threats both foreign and domestic. Now he walked them as a prisoner, bound in silver that burned his wrists and marked him as condemned. They brought him to the grand hall where the Blood Council waited. The chamber was vast and ancient, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with the bones of wolves who had died defending the pack. At the far end, on a throne carved from a single massive oak, sat Darius. He wore the crown Cale had once worn, simple iron worked with silver wolf's head, heavy with responsibility and grief. Around the throne, arranged in a semicircle, stood the council. 12 alphas and elders, the most powerful wolves in the Northern Reach, each one a master of their domain. Kyle recognized them all, had worked with them, argued with them, fought beside them. Now they looked at him with expressions ranging from pity to contempt to cold satisfaction. But his eyes found Alara immediately. She stood off to the side, guarded but not bound, her hands resting protectively over her belly. She wore clean clothes now, simple but well-made, evidence that Sylvain had kept her promise. Her hair had been brushed and braided, and someone had given her a cloak lined with fur against the cold. She looked small in that vast space, fragile and alone. But when their eyes met, Cale saw no fear in hers, only trust, only faith. It nearly broke him. "Cale Thornheart," Darius said, his voice carrying through the hall with practiced authority. "You stand accused of treason against the Northern Reach, of breaking your oath to the Blood Council, and of granting unlawful sanctuary to enemies of the realm. How do you answer these charges?" Kyle took a breath, steadying himself. "Guilty, on all counts." A ripple of shock ran through the council. They had expected him to fight, to argue, to mount some defense. Instead, he had given them exactly what they wanted, confession without condition. "You admit your crimes?" one of the elders asked, disbelief in his voice. "I admit that I made choices the council did not approve of," Kyle said carefully. "I admit that I defied direct orders to execute 300 refugees who had committed no crime beyond being born in the wrong territory. I admit that I believed, and still believe, that mercy is not weakness, but the highest expression of strength." He paused, letting his words settle. "If that is treason, then yes, I am guilty." "It is treason," Darius said quietly, "and the punishment is death, I know." "Then you accept this judgment?" "No," Kyle said, and his voice rang clear as a bell. "I accept responsibility for my choices, but I do not accept that mercy deserves death, and I will not renounce what I know to be right, even to save my own life." Darius's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice." "Wait!" a voice called out, echoing through the hall. Every head turned. Alara had stepped forward, moving past her guards with surprising speed. She walked to the center of the hall, directly between Kyle and the throne. And then she did something that made the entire council gasp. She knelt, not in submission, not in supplication, but in offering. She pressed both hands to the stone floor, and light began to pour from her palms. The same silver-gold radiance Cale had seen in the clearing, the mark of the Pathfinder awakening. It spread across the floor like water, flowing toward the council, toward Darius, toward every wolf in the hall. And where it touched them, they saw. Visions flooded Cale's mind, not his own, but shared, projected through Ilara's power. He saw the refugees he had sheltered, not as threats, but as people. Saw their faces, their stories, their desperate flight from a land ravaged by plague and famine. Saw mothers clutching starving children, warriors with empty eyes, elders too weak to travel further. Saw them arriving at Ironwood's borders with nothing but hope, begging for mercy that should have been granted freely. He saw himself making the choice to open the gates, saw the council's fury, their accusations, their demands for blood. Saw himself refusing over and over until they had no choice but to remove him by force. And he saw what came after, the refugees driven out into the wilderness, hunted like animals, slaughtered without trial or mercy, bodies left to freeze in the snow, children torn from their parents, the very thing he had tried to prevent, carried out in his absence. The vision ended. The light faded. Ilara collapsed, her body trembling with exhaustion, and Cale lunged forward to catch her before she hit the stone. The hall was silent. Every wolf stood frozen, still processing what they had seen, what they had felt. The truth, stripped of politics and pride and convenient lies. Darius rose from his throne slowly, his face pale. "She showed us—" "The truth," Cale said quietly, cradling Ilara against his chest. "The truth you have been trying not to see." "But the refugees were dangerous," one of the council members protested weakly. "They could have brought disease, conflict." "They brought nothing but need," Cale interrupted, "and we answered with violence. That is the legacy you built, Darius. That is what you call necessary." His brother stood silent, staring at the place where Ilara's light had touched the floor. Then slowly, he descended from the throne. He crossed the hall and knelt beside Cale, his eyes fixed on Ilara's unconscious face. "She is a true pathfinder," Darius said, wonder in his voice. "The goddess walks with her." "Yes," Cale said simply, "and the child she carries is yours." "Yes." Darius closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had changed, softened. "Then I cannot condemn you. To kill you would be to kill what the goddess herself has blessed." He looked up at the council, his voice carrying clear authority. "I revoke the charge of treason. Cale Thornheart is pardoned, effective immediately." "Your Majesty," one of the elders began to protest. "The decision is made," Darius said firmly. "And if any among you wish to challenge it, you may face the Pathfinder's truth yourselves." No one spoke. No one dared. Darius stood and offered Cale his hand. After a long moment, Cale took it, allowing his brother to pull him to his feet with Ilara still cradled in his arms. "I was wrong," Darius said quietly, for Cale's ears alone, "about the refugees, about mercy, about you." He paused. "I do not expect forgiveness, but I offer you what I can, your life, your freedom, and a place in this kingdom, if you will take it." Kyle looked at his brother, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes, the weight of guilt that mirrored his own. They had both made choices, both paid prices, both learned, too late. That righteousness without compassion was just another form of cruelty. "I accept," Kyle said, "not for myself, but for her, for our child. They deserve a home where they will be safe." Darius nodded. Then he turned to face the council once more, his voice ringing with formal authority. "Let it be known throughout the Northern Reach, Cale Thornheart is restored to his rank and holdings. He and the Pathfinder will be given lands in the eastern valleys, where they may build their home in peace. And any wolf who seeks to harm them will answer to me personally." The council murmured acceptance, some reluctant, some relieved, but none dared challenge the High Alpha's decree. Kyle carried Ilara from the hall, following guards who led him to private chambers where she could rest. He laid her gently on the bed, brushing damp hair from her forehead, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. She had given everything to show them the truth, her strength, her power, perhaps even years of her life. The Pathfinder gift demanded a price, and she had paid it willingly. For him, for their child, for a future neither of them had dared to hope for. A healer arrived with tea and salves, tending to Ilara with quiet efficiency, while Cale stood watch. Hours passed, the sun climbed and fell, and finally, as twilight painted the windows purple and gold, Ilara's eyes opened. She found him immediately, her gaze questioning. Cale took her hand, pressing it to his lips. "We are free," he whispered. "Pardoned. Darius has given us land in the eastern valleys. We can build a home there, raise our child in peace." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of relief so profound it shattered the last walls around her heart. She pulled him close, burying her face against his chest, and he held her as the moon rose outside their window, silver and eternal, witnessing the beginning of their redemption. The eastern valley lay beneath the gaze of the ancient moon, silver fields broken by icy rivers, bounded by forests so old that silence itself had settled between their roots. Kyle guided Ilara through the snow, past the stone arch that marked the border of their newly granted land. The wind sang with a softer voice here. The scent of pine and frost promised beginnings, not exile. They settled in a cottage built long ago by hands that had remembered the art of making shelter beautiful as prayer. Its hearth was cold at first, but Chaol struck flint and flame, lighting the fire that would guard them through each night. Ilara moved in silence, arranging dried herbs, placing the iron ring symbol on the mantle, proof of their lineage and redemption. Those first days were a slow redemption. Ilara's strength returned, her child growing bold beneath her ribs, and she walked at dawn, letting the moonstone hanging at her throat catch the rising sun. Chaol hunted and repaired what needed mending, his hands graced now by purpose rather than violence. He learned stillness from her, how healing was not fixing, but enduring, not silence, but the wisdom learned within it. The pack watched from the woods, uncertain but curious. No threat came. Rumors spread. Some called Ilara a witch, others saw her as a blessing. Yet none challenged the High Alpha's order, and the elders of Ironwood sent gifts in uneasy truce: firewood, smoked venison, a cloak for the child that would arrive beneath the lunar season. On the evening frost turned crimson beneath the sunset, Chaol found Ilara outside, her hands buried in the snow where frost roses bloomed against all nature. She showed him the symbol, petals of blue ice, a single drop of blood at the center, as if the moon itself wept and remembered all they had suffered. He knelt beside her, wordless, sharing in the reverence. "For all wounds redeemed," he whispered, voice shivering as the wind. She traced the scar on his wrist with gentle fingers. The iron ring glinted in the moonlight, a mark of both bondage and mercy, a vow remade in suffering, never again to be broken by pride or old pain. Ilara pressed her palm to his chest, feeling each heartbeat, each redemption born of love chosen and not rewarded. Silent tears fell, the wind held its breath. On the longest night, the child came beneath the cold fire of the moon. Ilara labored without sound. Chaol held her, guiding her through pain that felt ancient as the stars. When dawn finally broke, the child's first cry rose, echoing against stone and snow, announcing to all things living that here, in exile, something holy had been reborn. They named her Sarah, Moonborn, Pathfinder. She was claimed in ritual before the flames, Chaol binding both mother and daughter with the iron ring, Ilara blessing her cheeks with crushed frost rose petals. Pack and elders arrived as witnesses, and the night became sacred, thick with prayer and song, with the promise that rejection mattered less than the love that followed. Afterward, Chaol stood outside, snow swirling, breath rising. He faced the mountains, feeling the wound of the past and the scar of redemption. Ilara joined him, daughter in arms, her cloak brushed by distant light. "What is strength, if not choosing mercy?" he murmured. Ilara's hand found his, and together they watched the moon descend, knowing that every scar, every exile had led them to this silent moment where love was not victory, but proof, suffering transformed by the choice to embrace what was broken. If your heart beat alongside ours, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.